Hey there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Today we are going to introduce and start talking about that second chemical reaction that is required for all cells on this that we know of on this life, on this planet, to get usable energy. So the first one we talk about photosynthesis, and we're going to start by recapping that very briefly because it sets us up for that second type of chemical reaction called cellular respiration. This one, the details on this one get a little tricky, but today we're just going to, right here, we're going to focus about the big picture, right? We're going to talk about what's its purpose, where it takes place, a little bit about how it happens, just a little bit, and then talk a little bit about, actually there's a couple different kinds, and we're going to talk briefly about those as well. So let's go ahead and get right into it by recapping where we left off, because that sets us up going forward. So we first started talking about setting up for cellular respiration is the reaction of photosynthesis. The purpose of photosynthesis is to convert light energy into stored chemical energy. And it does that by taking that light energy and using also with carbon dioxide and water to create glucose. That is our stored chemical energy right there. Right? So just kind of recap, it took us 6 carbon dioxides because we needed all the amount of stuff to build this glucose. So we needed all the carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. So we took our 6 carbon dioxides, our 6 waters, activated by light energy to break those bonds, rearrange those molecules so that we could create this very large glucose molecule, and we had some leftover oxygen as well, 6 oxygens left over. All right. Now, we really want to emphasize, now we have this huge molecule here, and while water has 2 bonds, right? Carbon dioxide has a couple bonds. Glucose here has a lot of atoms, and so it's a lot of stored chemical bonds. Remember, and each chemical bond between 2 different atoms is chemical energy, and it's potential energy that could be used for something else, say recharging ATPs. And this one's got a lot of bonds here. This is a really easy molecule for our cells to be able to break all these bonds and get that energy. All right. So this is a great molecule to carry that energy from one part to another. All right. So now we've got that light energy into stored chemical energy. Now let's take that next step and be able to use that chemical energy. So we're going to hop over here real quick. All right, so now we're over here on this board here, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we basically have taken what we've learned from photosynthesis and to apply it into creating usable energy in the cell. And so what I have right here is I have an animal cell. All right, this is an animal eukaryotic cell. I just decided to do that one. But this could be for any type of cell, because remember, organisms that need usable energy is all life. All right, it just depends on how it gets that usable energy. If this was a plant cell, we're talking about photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast, and then just right over, it goes over to the second organelle. In the case for us, we have to take in the glucose. We have to eat that glucose as a heterotroph, and then we can break it down in this organelle that we find in there called the mitochondria, all right, also known as the powerhouse of the cell. We're going to talk a little bit about why that's slightly misleading. All right, so what we have here is we have the mitochondria. It's got that outer membrane, and it's actually got an inner membrane as well. It's a double membrane organelle, and that's because we think that it used to be a prokaryote in the very, very first eukaryotic cells that were engulfed. This would kind of be the membrane of the old prokaryote, and here's the membrane of the one that absorbed it using phagocytosis, type of endocytosis. All right. So the whole purpose of cellular respiration is to be able to take that stored chemical energy, which we just created using glucose, or in the form of glucose, and now we're going to turn it into usable energy, which we know we can get from the molecule ATP. All right. So let's kind of start this reaction here. We have glucose, all its carbons and hydrogens. Right. We know it's C6H12O6. That's a lot of carbons and hydrogens and oxygens, a lot of those chemical bonds there that we can break. So instead of, we built in photosynthesis this really big molecule, and now we have that in the presence of oxygen All right, let's take those 6 oxygens. All right, and in this case here, we're going to create the products. Our end goal here is to take that glucose, break it down, so that those that chemical energy inside those chemical bonds can be used to reattach a phosphate to ADP, turning it back into ATP. All right. In that case here, so we end up getting ATPs. All right, we're recharging them. Remember, by recharge, I mean you're turning ADP back into ATP. So what's happening here, remember, is you're taking that ATP, it becomes ADP, and now we're doing this right here. We're turning it back into ATP. All right, but now we've broken apart this big glucose molecule, and we have a few extra oxygen molecules there as well. All right, that's happening here in our mitochondria. We can start rebuilding some of these smaller molecules, and what we end up remaking with those broken pieces of glucose, as we break it apart, all right, they start forming carbon dioxides. And they start forming water molecules. In fact, if I take 1 glucose and 6 oxygens, and when I break it apart, it creates 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters. This should look familiar, right? Photosynthesis is about taking smaller molecules, carbon dioxide and water, and building them up to create glucose, right? In this case here, we're taking glucose and breaking it apart, and it's going to result in making carbon dioxides and water. They're almost they're opposites of each other. All right, they almost act like they were opposite types of chemical reactions. All right, and the whole goal of doing that is to take that stored chemical energy in the form of glucose and turn it into usable energy in the form of ATP. What it does is it creates 38 ATPs. That's a lot of ATPs to recharge. All right, it recharges 38 batteries. Now, with that said, this reaction takes a little bit, all chemical reactions take a little bit of activation energy to get going. This one takes 2 ATP of activation energy, all right, to do that, assuming all the enzymes are there. Without enzymes, this activation energy is actually about 15 to 20 ATPs. All right, with enzymes there, the whole purpose of enzymes is to lower that activation energy. We only need energy from 2 batteries, 2 ATPs to do this, and we recharge 36. So what some people say is, since I recharged 36, but I had to use 2 to do this, if I made $38 but had to spend $2 on, if I made $38 at a lemonade stand, but I had to spend $2 on buying the lemonade, what I made is a net of $36. And so some people say that this is a net of 36 ATPs, only because I had to use 2 to put in there. All right. So, what is its purpose so far? Is to create chemical energy into usable energy by taking glucose and using it to recharge ATPs. And so I have my glucose and my oxygen as my reactants, ATP, carbon dioxide, and water as my products. All right, where does this happen? This happens at the mitochondria. All right, and it happens by breaking down that glucose to recharge those ATPs. Now, there's one last thing I want to talk about here, and it's this one right here. And when we talk about the details of cellular respiration, we're going to talk about this oxygen. This reaction can happen with oxygen, or it can happen without oxygen. All right, when it happens with oxygen, this is called an aerobic respiration. That prefix aero, right, means air. So this is in the presence of, in air, but more specifically oxygen. I'm just going to write it bigger. This is called aerobic respiration because it has oxygen. All right, we're going to talk later that there is something called anaerobic, prefix an meaning not, air meaning or aero meaning air, without water or without oxygen, this reaction is able to occur when their oxygen levels are very low. I have glucose, but not enough oxygen to make this reaction. This reaction is not nearly as efficient. It creates a lot less ATP. And we'll talk more about that in a more detailed video, but I want to bring up that terminology now. All right, so we've talked about what it is, where it happens, how it happens. We mentioned a little bit things about things like the net ATP and talking about aerobic versus anaerobic. That's going to be it for this video because this is just the big picture, talking about the reactants, the products, where, why. All right, we'll talk more about it in more details next time. So thank you very much for watching. Good luck, and may the science be with you.